This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with host Ben Pratt.
Molecules that shouldn't get into your bloodstream actually end up in your bloodstream, so that can contribute to skin issues and migraines and autoimmune conditions and so many other things.
Happy New Year! This is the first Fit to Succeed podcast episode in 2020. Today we are very privileged to have with us a guest who actually is releasing the 5th edition of her famed book, Digestive Wellness. Her name is Dr. Liz Lipski. Liz, thanks for joining us on the Fit to Succeed show.
I'm so glad to see you again. It's been a while since we've been together.
It certainly has. It's been quite a few years, actually, I think, since we met in person. And I'm pleased to welcome you on the show today because we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that you have talked about for years on the digestive system and nutritional health. So perhaps just to give the listeners a little bit of background so that they know who you are. They obviously know now you're an author, but at the same time, I want them to understand that you're a professor and that you currently work within the nutrition programs at Maryland University of Integrative Health. Liz holds a PhD in clinical nutrition, and she's also a faculty member for the Institute of Functional Medicine. Now, today, we are recording on the day that her 5th edition of the book Digestive Wellness goes live for sale in the UK and Ireland. It already went live in America a month or so back. And it's kind of unique that this is the day of publication here in this country. And I read, I think, was the 3rd edition, perhaps 10 years ago, and thoroughly enjoyed it, Liz.
Thank you. It's been fun to kind of revisit this. You know, when I first wrote Digestive Wellness in 1995 and had the idea for it in 1993, there wasn't really anything out there. The concepts of dysbiosis or kind of slow growing infection in the gut or leaky gut syndrome. These are all brand new concepts. We didn't even really use the word microbiome yet.
Oh, really? Wow.
But I really wanted to know more about it. And so I went to Dr. Stephen Berry, who was then the founder of what's now Genova Diagnostic Lab, which is a lab that's in the UK and Ireland and also in the States. And I said, you don't know me, but this is what I want to do. He goes, oh, we don't have the time to do it, but somebody needs to write this book. And I really wrote it because I was curious. And I think I'm telling your listeners this. It's like, if you have an idea that kind of burns inside of you, do it, no matter who you are, because somebody wants to hear about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really fascinating little background you've given there. I didn't know that you'd spoken to the head of Genova Diagnostics. I actually used to work with Genova when I did nutritional testing myself. So that's fantastic that was a link in that I was unaware of. But I'm still wondering, you said you were curious, but was there an underlying motivation as to why it was the digestive system that you particularly had a fascination for when nobody else seemed to have that fascination?
In those days, Genova, which was Great Smoky's lab, and Doctors Data Lab would have conferences, and they would train clinicians on how to use their testing. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating. I got to learn from Dr. Leo Gallen and Dr. Sidney Baker, and really it was formative in kind of my understanding. And it just piqued my curiosity because so many of my clients that I was working with had GI issues or immune issues, or they had migraines, and the migraines were due to food sensitivities or low blood sugar or hormonal changes. And so I really started thinking, like, how is digestive health related to overall health? And then I also had a doctor I was working with one of his patients. And he looked at me and he said about the stool testing, he said, these tests are going to change all of internal medicine. Right. And that kind of, I was like, well, that's really interesting. And it just kind of went in there. And I just got really curious. It's like, well, my clients need this. And I think I really want to know more about it. So when I wrote the book, originally, I wasn't the expert. But then people started coming to see me who had all kinds of digestive issues. from all over the world and country. And then you learn it as you do it. And, 25 years later, I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on it.
Well, I would like to wish you congratulations, because to keep a book in print, not just the original, but to have 5 editions after 25 years is quite the feat. And as a very minor author myself, I know how hard it is to keep a book popular, and yours just seems to keep going, and that's fantastic.
I have to say, every time I decide to redo it, I go, why didn't somebody tell me in the first place I should just pick one small area instead of like all of it? So it's kind of a big book, but it's fun and people find it useful, and that's why you write or why you even do podcasts like this. You hope that one person will be affected and it'll make a change in their life.
Indeed. I imagine as each edition has gone on, it's become harder and harder to determine where to stop, because the field of digestive science has exploded, and there's so much now probably compared to what there was back in 95.
Yeah, there's so much. I actually, while I was writing it, I kept thinking, I want to talk about this research, or I want to talk more about like how I really think about this, or how I do it, or do a show and tell. And there wasn't enough that you can put in a chapter or in a book, because at some point you have to stop.
Yeah.
So I made a little video course that goes along with it if people are interested. But most people, we need to know the basics. And one of your questions for me is like, why do people have poor digestive health? And for me, it's like, well, most of us aren't eating well. I just looked at the UK statistics and the Irish statistics, and
thank you.
50% of the food that people are putting in their baskets at the markets are ultra-processed foods. Right. And you're doing way better than we are in the States, because here 71% of our food is ultra-processed.
Wow.
And I think, starting with just increasing the quality of food. And I think fitness experts and people who are working with people with fitness, you're watching people dieting all the time. You're watching people do extreme kind of diet fads because they're training for an event, or but people might not really know. And food quality is so important. So for me, that's always a beginnings place. And then stress is another huge place, because the digestive system really runs mainly on the parasympathetic, that right?
Rest and digest.
But in our lives, we're just go. And then again, I think a lot of people don't move enough and people don't sleep enough. So, when we look at really digestive health and health overall, it's the basics. It's the roots of the tree that we need to pay attention to before we go chasing all the shiny baubles. Yeah, genomics and microbiome and fancy testing. And
that's really interesting me that you've said that so many of the things that modern day fitness professional will look to support and help a client with, such as movement, such as dietary habits and quality of food, such as managing stress, maybe even supporting sleep in some cases. A lot of modern personal trainers will be looking at those issues, and yet you're saying many of those same key issues are part of the problem of the 3 to 4 out of 10 people who are suffering from digestive health these days.
They are. Also one of the really fascinating parts of all this to me is that as you start looking at all the research on diabetes and cardiometabolic syndrome and obesity and fatty liver, that research is also pointing right back to the gut microbiome. And when the gut microbiome is disordered, when people have leaky gut, which is intestinal permeability, so that molecules that shouldn't get into your bloodstream actually end up in your bloodstream. So that can contribute to skin issues and migraines and autoimmune conditions and so many other things. But when you start looking at all of that, you see that even something that you don't think of, like type 2 diabetes or obesity, really has a role in the gut.
Mhm.
as a originator of some of that. And the same thing is true of people who have depression or anxiety. It's not all in the gut, but the gut brain is another new area where people are really looking and saying, how can we treat people who have mood issues or mental health diagnoses, even schizophrenia? How can we look at helping the gut balance to help the brain balance? And we see
Mhm.
that all the time. And we see that with exercise too, that when people exercise, their depression lifts.
Mhm, mhm, for sure. Now, you threw out quite a few phrases there, and I think we'll get into them more as we talk. We talked about the microbiome. You talked about leaky gut. You know, some of these key issues that relate to the gut. I just wonder if we could step back just a second, and let's look at something that you mentioned at the very early part of digestive wellness, and it's still in the 5th edition, which is great. And that is you use the phrase, "When in doubt, begin in the gut." Could you explain your rationale behind why you think we should always begin at the gut when looking at health?
Okay, well, the first piece of that is the reason why we eat food in the first place is not just because it's fun and it gives us energy. The reason why we eat food is to nourish every tissue and every cell in the body. So where we start as a nutrition professional or a fitness professional is we start with, well, what are you eating, right?
Hmm.
But then some people don't have enough stomach acid, or they have issues with absorption of those nutrients, and so the cells don't get what they need. So the tissues don't work right. So we always want to look at what's somebody eating, but can they actually digest and eliminate the wastes? And if they can do that well, then we know that the cells are probably getting most of what they need.
Hmm.
And most people, they complain of fatigue. And so you start thinking, well, where is that fatigue? Is it just not enough sleep, or is it that their cells aren't really getting the nourishment that they need?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I think as we think through that process of ensuring that what is going in our mouth is actually having a beneficial effect on our body, you know, that rings really true. So often we find in fitness, for example, if someone's dieting and trying to control calories, they just assume that whatever they put on their plate in terms of calories is what's going into the tank. But usually when I used to do a lot of nutritional advising, I would say to people, it's more to do with what gets in your body and then into your bloodstream. It's not what just goes in your mouth. And so if, like you said, if there's any digestive problems that are preventing energy or nutrition or micronutrients making it into the bloodstream, then that can have quite a knock-on effect the longer it exists. And something that comes to mind there, it's not necessarily something I'd planned to talk about, but that comes to mind there is there any simple things, signs or symptoms that people can look for that might be an indicator in the earlier stages of there being some sort of small or problematic digestive concerns?
Well, the obvious ones are that you won't really notice your digestive system unless there's something wrong with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not normal to have heartburn or to have lots of belching or have tons of gas, right?
Right.
Or it's not normal to only have a bowel movement every 3 days. It's also probably not normal to have 6 bowel movements a day. You know, so those are kind of like the regular kind of tip-offs. And if your digestive system is bothering you, then you know that something's off, right? So there's something that you can do about that right away. And then the other things that give you a tip-off, as I said, is not really good energy, not finding that you're able to focus that well. Migraines I've mentioned several times, but also skin issues, psoriasis, eczema,
Mm-hmm.
they're all kind of indications of leaky gut. And then also what we know is that anybody who has any kind of autoimmune condition like Parkinson's or MS or Hashimoto's or lupus, that they also all have impaired gut function. And so when we think about skin, we think about mental health, when we think about really most things, you want to start saying, well, is there a gut component to this? And if so, how can we help somebody optimize that function?
Mm-hmm. I find that really fascinating, and I'm sure some of the listeners will too, Dr. Lipski. But one of the things that comes to my mind there is that if someone has skin issues like eczema or psoriasis, they probably will go and see a dermatologist, not somebody who's trained in gut health. If somebody has, issues with migraines, it's unlikely they'll go and see someone who is trained in gut health. And so there's probably a few other conditions like that where there's symptoms that come to the surface that don't naturally direct people to look at gut health. Now, that kind of leans back to what you said in the beginning about starting the gut, but most specialisms don't necessarily do that. So how can people overcome that problem?
Well, I think sometimes we have to go outside of the health service and seek somebody who we think can work with us on health optimization rather than to focus on what's wrong with us, but to focus with us on what we can do to be empowered to put our own health into our own hands. Mm. And it's not always true. Like, I have a genetic disease and my son inherited it from me and I inherited it from my dad. And no matter what I did, it was there, right? So people have like health issues that they're not in control of, mm-hmm. but nonetheless, there's a lot, even with that genetic disease, that I'm totally in control of. And so it's really important to kind of have this empowerment so that self-care is important. So for example, like if you cut your finger, you go and you wash it off and you put a Band-Aid on it, right? Yeah. We know to do self-care and we do that instinctively. And for our own bodies, most people, let's say eczema, they'll say, oh, I know that when I put on a steroid cream, that the itchiness and the flakiness goes away. Yep. But that's more like putting a Band-Aid on it, right? Because what we know is that if you have leaky skin and skin inflammation, you're probably having leaky gut. You may also have leaky brain or leaky heart or leaky any other tissues. And this often manifests as food sensitivities or environmental sensitivities. Mm-hmm. In fact, a long time ago, I went to a conference for the Institute for Functional Medicine, and Dr. G. Monroe from the UK came and she spoke, and she talked about her patients who had migraines. Mm-hmm. And she said 100% of her patients with migraines had food sensitivities.
Oh, wow.
The biggest
That's
ones
really interesting.
Were wheat, eggs, dairy, chocolate, mm-hmm. the things that we really love to eat.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because that's me. I found out even as a young child at 10 and 11, I was getting terrible migraines, and it didn't take me too long with a bit of help from my mother to identify that chocolate and cheese were classic migrainous foods were part of the problem. So I always, even now, have to really take those carefully. Otherwise, it bites me back.
Yeah, it's a choice. Sometimes you go, it's my birthday, sorry, right? And you just go, I know it's going to bite me, but that's okay. I'm just going to go gently into this. Yeah. But most of the time you go, you know what? It's just not worth it.
Yeah, indeed. I totally agree. Now, I wonder if we could start, because what I wanted to do with you today is to go through a bit of a journey of the body, particularly the digestive system, and to just look at some real practical and helpful tips that the listeners can benefit from. So let's start in the mouth, which is the first point of the digestive system. And perhaps one of the simplest and often one of the most embarrassing problems that people experience that may be linked to digestive health issues is bad breath. Now, you state in your book that using mouthwash for bad breath is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. Now, what could be at the root of this problem then, Dr. Lipski, and can you suggest any better steps forward?
Yeah, so mouth health, it's the beginning of the digestive system, and our mouth is so important because we've all had that experience of like putting something in our mouth and going, no, right? And either stopping right there or spitting it out because it just doesn't taste right. So it's one of our first defense mechanisms against taking in things that are going to make us sick. Mm-hmm. But also when we have bad breath, often there's the first place to look is what's the health of your gums? Do you have periodontal disease? And even though it seems kind of insignificant, periodontal disease, gingivitis has been associated with Alzheimer's disease and heart disease So you want to really kind of make sure that your dental health is good and go see a dental hygienist and make sure that you don't have inflammation. And if you do, work with them. And that's typically the first place. Another thing that can cause bad breath is sinusitis and postnasal drip. And so kind of looking at that is a possible issue. And another area could be having low stomach acid or having heartburn, which you can have this sour taste that comes back into your mouth and might feel like bad breath. So those are the first places that I would look if somebody had chronic bad breath.
Fantastic. I think that's really helpful and nice to have a few other options to look for. One that I came across, and I wonder if you could maybe briefly answer this, it does go a little bit more in depth, is looking at a bacterial infection called H. pylori. Is that linked with bad breath?
It is. H. pylori is a bacteria that has been linked to ulcers, stomach ulcers. And it's a really odd bacteria because there's many different strains of it, species of it, and some of them are much more inflammatory than others. It's also been associated with gastric cancers. And so, yes, it can cause bad breath, and it can also cause ulcers and sometimes even GERD. So it's something to just check out. What's interesting that I think about it is that so many of us have H. pylori and it's causing no problems at all.
Oh, really?
And I think in the next 10 years, we'll see more on, well, which of these species do we really need to treat and which of them don't we need to treat?
Yeah, that would be fascinating. That's interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that research comes out in time. You mentioned there GERD, which is interesting because GERD, I guess, is the long fancy acronym that relates to reflux. And that leads us to the stomach. And perhaps heartburn is one of the most common digestive problems, with approximately 44% of people, as you state in your book, experiencing the condition on a monthly basis. So it would suggest that antacids are probably one of the most common medications taken in relation to digestive distress. So what might be the underlying causes of reflux and what holistic options are available to treat that?
Okay, so I think there are many. First of all, again, food sensitivities. I've had people who eggs give them GERD.
Oh, really?
I think in the UK it's called GORD, right?
It could be esophageal, yeah, because it's spelled with an O instead of an E.
Anyway, but heartburn, I think it's just really heartburn. And that reflux, we get acid up into the esophagus where it doesn't belong. And we don't have those mucus layers like the stomach has. So we experience that as pain. And so I think food sensitivities, I have one client, it was eggs. Every time she had eggs, she had heartburn. Another, it was dairy. Another, it was gluten containing grains. Those are always the big three to look at, but it can be almost any food like tomatoes or eggplants or nightshades. It's surprising. One of the other underlying issues is hiatal hernia. And this is something, I don't know if fitness trainers work ever with kind of helping people do visceral manipulation.
Probably not. They'd probably have to refer, I would have thought. But
yeah, sure. I would refer. So, but I think that visceral manipulation can really, with a good osteopath or chiropractor, can really make a difference, because sometimes you just have a little bit of your diaphragm that's kind of pushed up and it actually causes the food to reflux.
Right.
Stress, again, is a huge influence on GERD.
That's an interesting one. I'm just thinking of the mechanism there, because obviously you said already that the digestive system and activating the digestive system is linked to parasympathetic or relaxation responses, whereas stress is typically linked to sympathetic or active responses. So how does stress cause the GERD then?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that the stomach is this kind of it's a muscle, right? And it's a muscle that kind of does this contraction to mix up the food that we eat and break that down with enzymes and with hydrochloric acid and gastric acid, and break down proteins and start the real process of digestion. And that takes a lot of energy, and producing that gastric acid to take what's normally something like water, which is a pH around 7,
Mm-hmm.
7.3, or, or
Mm-hmm.
blood, to take that pH down to a level of 1 or 2, which is what we really need in the stomach. You're not just, it's not 7 times more, it's like 8 zeros more,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a lot more because it's a log, and so it's exponential. And to make that acid takes a huge amount of energy.
Right.
And I think that when we're stressed out, we're like putting that into our brain, and we're running around and we're doing all these other things. And I think it's just one of the things that your body goes, well, I can't deal with all the fires that are there right now, so this one's just going to get put on hold.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the mechanisms.
So if I understand you right, we're sort of saying here that because we're so sympathetically dominant when we're consistently stressed, we don't get into that parasympathetic control system. So the body isn't energizing or putting effort into creating enough stomach acid. And so it starts to lack. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
All right. I get it.
Or we can produce too much,
Mm-hmm.
right? But either way, it's like stress is not the friend of our digestive system. As you said, rest and digest.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I've read a few things about heartburn that suggest that some people say taking an antacid is not effective because heartburn or reflux can be caused by a lack of acid that doesn't activate the sphincter that closes at the bottom of the esophagus. Is there any truth to that?
There is some truth to it. One of the things that I like to tell people to just try is do a little self-test on yourself, and with a meal that has some protein in it, have a little bit of diluted vinegar. Maybe take a tablespoon or 2 of vinegar in a glass of water and drink that, and see if it makes you feel better or worse.
Right.
And then at the next meal, take some baking soda mixed in water. Take a half a teaspoon or so of baking soda, put it in some water, and drink that, and see like what makes you feel better or worse. If I give myself more alkaline with the baking soda, do I feel better because it's stopping that high acid? Or if I give myself more acid, does it make me feel better? And I think one of the issues with taking antacids all the time is that we actually need that acid. The acid breaks down protein. It also protects us against parasites and fungi and bacteria coming in with our food. So it's kind of like, okay, let's just prevent food poisoning and yeast overgrowth and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so when we're dampening that acid all the time, we open ourselves up for infections in the small and large intestine. And the other thing that we use that acid for is in this beginning part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. We use that acid for absorption of most of our minerals. And so when we don't have it, we can become mineral deplete.
Really, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought that one through before, that the antacids can actually be negative to our ability to absorb the minerals that we're even consuming.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. I love the self-test idea. I think that's really practical, and I hope that is beneficial for those who are listening. Now, you briefly mentioned there the duodenum as we enter from the stomach into the small intestine, and let's look at some of the common problems that we may experience there. Now, you mentioned this right at the beginning of the call, actually, Dr. Lipski, and that is that passing gas, flatulence, or bloating in the gut is perhaps some of the most common digestive problems observed or experienced in the small intestine. Now, you state in your book, this maybe is getting a bit personal for people, but you state that it's relatively normal to pass gas about 10 to 15 times a day. So perhaps an indicator for people as to what would be normal. So what would be an indication if there is a more significant problem related to excessive gas in the digestive system? And how could people manage that?
Okay, well, first of all, the important thing to know about gas is that human cells don't produce gas. It's the microbes in our belly that produce the gas. And those microbes are about as big as your liver. They're like somewhere between 3 and 7 pounds. So like 1.5 kilos to to 2.5 kilos.
Wow, so we're talking trillions and trillions of microbes then.
Trillions and trillions of microbes. And those microbes, when they're out of balance, they make a gas. And so when you find that you need to wear elastic waistbands because by the end of the day your belly is expanded, that's a sign that you've got some dysbiosis going on. Or if you have really stinky gas all the time, you might want to look further. My husband tells the story of this man who he worked with who shared an office with a couple of people, and this man's gas was so terrible that his coworkers said, you know, this is abusive. We can't work with you. And we can't work in the same office with you. And he did some stool testing and discovered that he had parasites and was able to get those treated. The gas and bloating issue often accompanies the diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, which we now know that IBS, which is characterized by like gas, bloating, discomfort that's relieved after you have a bowel movement, constipation, diarrhea, or alternating constipation and diarrhea, that more than half of the people who have been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome actually have a slow-growing infection called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And this can be treated with herbs or drugs. There's an antibiotic called rifaximin that pretty much stays in the gut, and it has some helpful benefits to the gut as well, and it's often used. And then there are herbal remedies that are used that are just as effective, that usually involve things like oil of oregano or berberine from golden seal or Oregon grape or barberry, and other aromatic oils like maybe thyme oil or garlic. And these can also kind of bring this down. So you know, what I love about this is that the quality of life for people who have irritable bowel syndrome sucks. It does. Like I've worked with people who don't want to leave the house before noon because they don't know how their bowels are going to be. I've worked with people who don't travel, people who know every single public restroom in their town, people who don't go to parties, don't go out to eat because their bowels aren't reliable. And the great news is, like, this can be treated like strep throat. It's an infection. Or sometimes it's lactose intolerance, or sometimes it's undiagnosed celiac disease or undiagnosed gluten intolerance. And so, you know, we used to just name it and say, well, eat more fiber and drink more water and get some exercise. But that's not the way to treat an infection.
No, I've heard people say, and maybe this is a little bit too simplistic, but you can correct me. But I've heard people say that IBS is essentially the diagnosis a doctor gives when they don't know what the digestive problem is. Maybe that's a bit too simplistic, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think you're exactly right. I think it's a catch-all, and you know, there are lumpers and splitters, and IBS is kind of a lump diagnosis. Oh, you got these symptoms. One of my teachers, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, he says he has a book called The Disease Delusion. He says just because we have like a group of symptoms doesn't mean that everybody who has those symptoms has them for the same reason. So like I mentioned several, like somebody could have IBS just because they don't digest dairy very well. Somebody else has it because they have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Somebody else has it because they have parasites or fungal overgrowth. Somebody else has undiagnosed celiac disease, you know. And so you really have to look at, or somebody else has it because they don't like to go to the bathroom when they're at work. Because having a bowel movement at work is too embarrassing, and so they don't do it, and so they end up constipated. And, you know, so you have to always look at, like, what are the root issues for any of these conditions and try to suss them out for each person. And so I think that as here in the States, we went to what we call ICD-10 codes, which are how many diagnoses there are. And there's 66,000 diagnoses, right?
Wow,
There used
that's
to
a
be
lot.
like 12,000 diagnoses. And so what's happening is we're starting to get more names for more things as people say, wait a minute, IBS, well, that's a diagnosis, but it doesn't really tell you that much about what's going on with this person.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think that's really a really good overview, and perhaps those who are listening who may have the IBS or know somebody who has IBS, maybe there's a need there to dig a little bit further, get some specialist help to find out what the deeper problems might well be. So let's move on, Liz, if we can. Let's look at the large intestine now, and perhaps the most common problem that affects the large intestine, you've mentioned already, is constipation. And you state in your book that affects 28% of the population, women twice as much as men, and that laxatives in the US, anyway, account for 1.26 billion in sales annually. So clearly the country, and I'm sure Europe's not too much different, is fairly blocked up. What's the clinical definition for constipation, and what are the likely underlying causes?
Okay, so the technical definition of constipation is that you have fewer than 3 bowel movements a week.
Right.
What's considered normal is somewhere between 3 and 21 bowel movements a week. However, that's not my definition of normal, because I think really everybody should be having somewhere between 1, 2, or even possibly 3 bowel movements every day. And it should really feel good when you're finished. It should feel like, wow, I feel really empty now.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times constipation is also defined as that people have incomplete bowel movements, that they go kind of halfway, and then maybe half an hour later or an hour later, they have another bowel movement. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of things. So the first thing is people don't get enough fiber in their diet. Most people eating kind of more modern foods, the fiber is stripped out of it because it's so much more fun to eat like a bagel or a croissant or a baguette than it is to have like really whole grain bread, right?
Sure.
It just goes down more easily, or to have cream of wheat instead of granola, or
and are grain fibers there, Liz? You mentioned, wholemeal bread. Are grain fibers as beneficial and helpful as fiber that we might get from whole fruit and vegetables? Or can they also be problematic if they are consumed too much?
Well, I think I like to see a variety of fibers. I like to see grains. I like to see fruits and vegetables. And I like to see legumes and nuts and seeds. Mm-hmm. I like to see them all. If I had to pick like one group, it's like eat more vegetables, period. Yeah. Okay.
Good.
And one of the fascinating things that we're finding is we've heard so much about like insoluble fiber, which helps your bowels move. But so much of the magic comes from the soluble fiber, which is also termed as resistant starch, which you hear about a lot in the fitness movement, and also prebiotic. And this insoluble resistant starch prebiotic fiber, which is all the same thing, comes from mostly vegetables and fruit. And what it does is it's the food for the microbiome. Mm-hmm. All those bacteria and fungi and even the viruses in your microbiota, this is what they eat. And so if we want to stay healthy, we really want both types of fiber, one that keeps your bowels moving and one that keeps your microbiota fed.
Are there any holistic solutions available beyond just, you've mentioned dietary there of eating the right types of fiber from different food sources, but if someone's constipated now and they want to try and act on it, are there any holistic options available for them that might help?
Yeah, like one of my most favorite options is taking magnesium. Magnesium helps us you can start with like 300 or 400 milligrams a day. And then if you don't notice a change, keep bumping it up. I have people do it to kind of bowel tolerance. Right. If you take too much, you'll get gas, or you'll go, uh-oh, I have to have a bowel movement right now. And you don't really want to have that. Yeah. So, but you can kind of bump it up. And, most of us don't get enough magnesium in our food. And so magnesium really helps with this peristalsis, that kind of snake eating a rat kind of movement of everything through. And so just adding some magnesium can really be helpful. It's also really great for migraines, and for muscle tension.
Yeah.
I had a client and she said, I want you to take some calcium magnesium. She came back, she had menstrual cramps. She came back and she said, I never realized that my shoulders were like this until they were like this. It's also useful for sleep and really anything that makes us tense, because magnesium is a kind of relaxation mineral. Other things that can help is probiotics, or eating cultured and fermented foods.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Yes, by adding to the microbiome and helping that to resolve itself on its own accord. That's fantastic. Now, we've actually talked a lot about the microbiome, and perhaps for a final question, let's just touch on that very briefly. How vital do you think a well-balanced microflora population is to our digestive wellness? And would you emphasize prebiotics, which feed the microflora, or would you emphasize probiotics, as in supplements that we can take that already have the bacteria in them? Which would be better for bowel health?
Well, I think it's easy to take prebiotics because you just take it. And actually changing the way we eat and eating more prebiotic rich and probiotic foods means we have to actually change our lifestyle in some way. But I really think that what we've seen over millennia is that people have developed their health by figuring out which foods are the most helpful for them. And what we know is that these prebiotic and probiotic rich foods like yogurt and kefir and sauerkraut and kimchi and homemade pickles, and I make a cashew coconut kefir, and I make my own kimchi, miso soup. All of these foods really confer a great health benefit. I do also love probiotics, and I've published papers on probiotics. What you'll find is that probiotics can be really useful, and where probiotic research is heading is, you have constipation type irritable bowel syndrome. These are the specific probiotics that the research has demonstrated are going to be most useful. You have Crohn's disease, or you have ulcerative colitis, or you have eczema. These are the specific probiotics, and that's kind of where we're heading, is to really refine that research. Nonetheless, taking an overall kind of well-balanced probiotic can be helpful, but we're kind of shifting the perspective on that. 5 years ago, I would have said everybody should just take one every day. And now it's like,
I said that.
Yeah, and now it's like, wait a minute, isn't that like giving people like a monocrop?
Right.
Because you might be getting as many as 8 different, microbes in there, or 2 microbes. But, when each of us have somewhere between 300 and 400 different kinds of species in our gut, what happens when we just keep flooding it with these same few over and over? And so when we eat food, so for example, when I make sauerkraut, there are probably at least a dozen different microbes in there. And then when I make cashew coconut kefir or pickles, there are different microbes. And so, or when we eat bread, even I know bread is considered like bad these days, but it used to be called the staff of life. And it's a mainstay of a lot of people. But when you think about it, it is a cultured food because you put yeast in it and it rises. And so, one of the cool things is when you make sourdough bread at home, you have the same microbes that are actually in your home environment that end up raising your bread.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
We're not different from our microbes. We are, and there's so many more of them than there are of, there's one of me, there's one of you. And as you said, there's trillions of them. And we have as many of them as we have cells in our body. And they really help run our metabolism, whether we're fat or thin, whether we're happy or depressed, the health of our skin. there's nothing that they don't have their like little hands in. Even the gut microbiome, now there's good papers on glaucoma and kidney
Oh,
function.
really? Wow.
You know, and you think kidney function, glaucoma, like what does that have to do with the gut microbiome? But, you know, there is a microbiome of your eye, and there's a microbiome of your inner eye, and there's a microbiome of your pancreas and probably of your islets of Langerhans, and there's a microbiome of your muscles and your fascia, even though we don't know what these are yet.
Wow, it is fascinating, isn't it? It's really fascinating. One of the reasons, I guess, why I asked that question is because if someone has dysbiosis, so their bacteria flora are out of balance, they have a bit too many of the less beneficial bacteria and not enough of the good guys, if they were to take prebiotics, which is fuel for the bacteria, could that have the effect of growing the negative affecting bacteria more? Or should they try to overwhelm it with probiotics or good bacteria?
So I love this question because it's a paradox, okay? So when somebody who's healthy, eating prebiotics and cultured and fermented foods, we're going to feel better eating those. But somebody who has dysbiosis, sometimes we temporarily have to restrict all of those,
Right.
because they can feed the bad microbes as well. And so we have diets like the specific carbohydrate diet and the FODMAP diet, or even a paleo-immune or ketogenic diets that actually starve the microbiome. And they starve the bad guys. They also starve the good guys. So I just read a paper this week, long-term Paleolithic diet, not good for microbiome. And we know that even in 4 weeks on a FODMAP diet, that the amount of bifidobacteria changes and diminishes really fast.
Oh, really?
So we know that these diets, like one of the mechanisms that makes them work is that they starve out the microbes to hopefully let the gut reestablish itself. And you usually do this for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and then you start slowly reintroducing food at the same time that maybe you've been giving some herbs like oil of oregano, or having people eat lots of garlic, which is going to change their breath, but who cares, right? Or taking deodorized garlic like Kyolic or something. So it is a paradoxical question. It's like in good health, we eat one way. And then when we're trying to rebalance, sometimes we have to really avoid all these, what we think are the most healthy foods. And it can be also sometimes, and maybe this will ring true to some of the people who are listening, they'll eat something like you said, oh, like if you had cheese, or you had, what was your other one, bread?
Bread, I'm not sure. Well, for me, were you saying?
For you, for your migraines.
Oh, it was chocolate was the other one.
Chocolate, okay. So chocolate and cheese both have what we call bioactive amines, one of which is histamine. And so what we'll see is that there's a group of people who they'll say, every time I take probiotics, I feel worse. Oh, I can't eat leftovers. I have to be really careful. All my food has to be very, very fresh.
Right.
I have problems eating fish or sausage or anything cultured or fermented. Makes me feel way worse. And then again, that's telling you, oh, this person's having like histamine or other bioactive amine reactions. And then we have to try a low histamine diet.
Right.
And so there isn't kind of one size fits all. But what's so fascinating is there is a shoe that will fit everybody.
Yeah, for sure. I really like that, because it also was very practical, that sort of thought process to allow people to just start to pay attention to the way food affects them. And I think if there's anything I've learned over the years about food and diet and digestive health, it's you have to be a little bit more consciously aware of the food you've recently eaten and the way that it's making you feel. And as that awareness goes up, you start to begin to dial into things that actually affect you positively or affect you negatively, for sure. It's been a really fascinating discussion, Dr. Lipski. Time has really crept up on us. I can't believe how quick that's gone. I would love to spend loads more time asking lots of great questions and digging into it, but you've written it all in such a great and wonderful book. So I would encourage people to go out there and to buy Digestive Wellness, released today, the 5th edition with lots of new additions. So please look that up. And also you've mentioned at the very start of the call that you also have a video course called The Art of Digestive Wellness, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Just before we end, Dr. Lipski, is there anything at all that we've discussed or anything you'd like to cover very quickly before we bring it to a close?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the show, and it's so nice to reconnect with you. And I just want to kind of re-emphasize what you just said is tuning into what makes you feel better or worse. Sometimes just writing down everything you eat and drink for a week, and writing down like if you felt better or worse after you ate it, or how you felt that day, and trying to see, be your own detective can be really useful. A doctor I used to work with, he'd have people, he'd say, okay, every time you eat a meal and you feel really energized and great after it, write that at the top half of your page of paper. And every time you eat something that your energy just kind of droops afterwards, or it makes you feel anxious or jittery, or you get gas or anything, then put that on the bottom. And after a week, then rip your paper in half and keep refining what makes you feel good.
That's a really great idea. So simple as well, and so practical. I love that. Thanks so much. It's been such a pleasure, and I really wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Ben.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.